We want to bring in our panel now for some political analysis. David Nakamura covers the White House for The Washington Post. Rachael Bade covers Congress, and she has just moved over to The Washington Post. She's also a CNN political analyst. We want to welcome Eugene Scott to this broadcast. He's also with The Washington Post. And Leslie Sanchez is a CBS News contributor and a very familiar face to our viewers who tune in to CBSN, our digital network. Leslie, let me start with you. You heard the president lay out his case for this emergency. New York Times, though, in terms of writing about the fallout, said it was the most punishing defeat Mr. Trump has experienced as a president. Do you agree?
I don't think Republicans are going to agree on that. What's interesting, I was speaking to a lot of the legislative leaders and business leaders along the Texas-Mexico border, and they feel this is not a real solution, but a political one. But if you look at the fact that there's a tremendous amount of baseline support to secure the border, where the president does not have the support, is over 60%, according to what Gallup has been looking at, some other research, don't support the idea of a physical wall. So when it's parsing those words. I think, Margaret, if he can show he is securing with both technology, technical infrastructure, human capital, all the things that border enforcement is saying they need, then I think he's going to get a legislative win on that. However, if it just looks like a contiguous border, he's not. And I do want to point out the fact the president has walked that back. He was on numerous occasions saying, what does the wall go, the entire 2,000-mile border? But that's not the reality. So with that extent and that in mind, I think we're making progress.
Can I just follow up on, your mention that this is a political solution? Republicans on the Hill feel the same way, and they're very annoyed in some cases that they're being sort of unwittingly dragged into the president's 2020 re-election effort. The president feels the Trump and that declaring this emergency is going to help his own re-election, but this is dividing lawmakers, and you just saw that with your interviews right there with Will Hurd saying this was a bad idea, that he could see constituents have their land seized and that it would be taking money from the military, with people like Lindsey Graham saying, this is going to secure our country. And so right now it's really dividing the party.
Just real quick on that part, and also in the conference, there was a big point of saying, not only with Congressman Hurd, but Congressman Henry Cuellar, who was also on the board of the Democrat, saying we want topography, the local law, leaders to be involved in the discussion, because you don't want to be building, eminent domain on people's lands, the issues of livestock and using the Rio Grande for other purposes. So there's a lot of disagreement on how that's done. But now that the president is backpedaling on how you secure the border, I think there can be a positive.
I would add one thing, was whether this is a win or a loss for the president. I mean, the president wants to be seen as the ultimate winner here, but just look at his news conference in announcing this. It took him about 5 minutes to even get to the idea that he was declaring a national emergency. He was acknowledging it was probably going to be stopped in court. He didn't act like a winner in sort of announcing this in the Rose Garden the way he did. He took questions on a lot of other topics, which is fine. We want to hear him make news. But if he really believed in what he was doing here, believed this was a really, truly winning strategy, I think you would have seen a much more determinative announcement in the way that he rolled that out.
But one of the reasons I believe that the president was not able to communicate the national emergency in a winsome way is because it's not winsome. It's widely unpopular with many people outside of his base, which is where the majority of voters are. We know that this is an approach that is popular with Republicans who back Trump, but we know that he won because so many independents came over to support him, and he needs those votes as well if he's going to do well in 2020. And recent polling, especially after the midterm, shows that he's not doing well with those voters.
Rachel, I want to ask you about the other news we have here from that tremendous interview with 60 Minutes and Andrew McCabe. Look, McCabe's gone. Jim Comey is gone. There's a new Attorney General, Bill Barr, who's now on the job, and Senator Lindsey Graham is now in the chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee. So where does all of this head next?
That story is not over. McCabe may be gone. Rosenstein is heading toward the exits. But this whole notion about this 25th Amendment and whether there was actually a conversation to try to oust the president or see if there was support to oust the president, Republicans are going to continue in that vein. And it's interesting from this interview, it looks like Lindsey Graham, as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, is going to pick up right where House Republicans left off when they lost the majority and Democrats took over. Before the past 2 years, Republicans in the House, they've sort of been doing this investigate the investigator, sort of an inquiry about whether there's bias at the FBI or the Justice Department. That has gone away. They've lost their subpoena power. And Graham is showing that he's not only going to pick that up, he potentially is going to go even further by telling you that he is willing to subpoena Rosenstein and bring in McCabe to actually ask him what happened with these conversations.
And where does that fit in, Eugene, to the political strategy here in terms of laying the groundwork for the Mueller report?
Well, I would imagine that in part it is to keep people questioning Mueller and the bias that the president believes exists within the FBI that's working against him. It's the whole witch hunt idea just taken to the next step, trying to put some meat on those bones and looking at people like Lindsey Graham to be able to do that and argue that the president's suspicions are credible and they're not irrational. Whether or not they're actually going to be able to do that, people are still waiting to see. But what we do know is that most Americans, according to polling we have in the Washington Post, want to see this investigation continue because they do believe that Mueller is more likely to be credible than the president himself.
David, switching gears here, we heard overnight that Heather Nauert, who had been at the State Department as an undersecretary and as a spokesperson there, is withdrawing her name from consideration to be the next UN ambassador. What happened? Why did she do that?
What we understand is that her nomination was languishing in part because her own team had not even forwarded all their necessary paperwork to the Senate committee that would have to do her oversight hearing. And I think the reason now we're finding out is that she actually employed a nanny who was in the country legally from another country, but had not been necessarily had a work permit to work here legally. Taxes were not being paid on time. Nauert had apparently flagged this internally, but it's become something of an issue of this potentially being a problem and a disqualifying a measure, something that would be embarrassing not only to her family, but also could stand in the way from the Senate moving forward. This is a blow to the administration, though, because she's certainly someone I think that the president had grown to trust in her role as a spokeswoman at the State Department. And he'd had his own, President Trump had his own problems with the previous UN Secretary, Nikki Haley, in some cases. And he believes this would be someone who would be very loyal to him. But they now seem to be making the decision to move on.
Leslie, is it disqualifying?
For some it is, and for some it's not. It just reminds me of the 1993 Nannygate, when you had the revelations, that Bill Clinton was trying to nominate not one, but two attorney generals that both had issues with nannies who were undocumented. But in more recent history, under Bill Clinton, and even if you think about under Trump, Wilbur Ross, who had undocumented, perhaps they didn't pay taxes on people that worked domestically in their household, they managed to get through. So they're threading that needle. I think it's changed a lot in that conversation. But again, going back to our first topic, it becomes an issue of labor and undocumented individuals working in these households and not paying taxes.
But Rachel, some have put this in the context of the president has had this happen with a few different nominees, or at least people he said he's going to nominate. Is the White House really setting up their selections for success? The president's tweeting this morning blaming Democrats for stalling his ambassadors from being confirmed.
Yeah, look, that's just a way to sort of shift the narrative and try to point the finger. There's been complaints, including by some Republicans on the Hill. The White House does not do enough to vet people before they actually put them forward. And so, yeah, this has been an issue. Mick Mulvaney, now the acting chief of staff, he had his own issue with not paying taxes for, again, I believe it was a nanny. So again, it's an embarrassment for the administration, and Republicans would like to see them button that up before they actually move people forward.
And it comes on the heels of all this reporting in the Washington Post and other places, the New York Times, about the president's own employment of undocumented workers at his golf club for years, at a time that he was running for president and railing on the use of undocumented immigrants, now declaring this a national emergency. So this would have fed into all sorts of other questions that Congress and certainly Democratic lawmakers will want to ask.
Eugene, we had two of our senators as guests from Munich, from the security conference, and there's been a lot said about the importance or the statement being made to have such a big congressional delegation at what is a conference built around celebrating alliances, something that the administration is often criticized for not valuing enough. You had former Vice President Biden there, you had the current Vice President Mike Pence there. What was the reaction like in terms of Pence's message to the room?
Well, for the most part, it was silent. There was a lack of confidence in the message that Mike Pence was delivering, suggesting that the America First mindset that the president has been campaigning on and leading since entering the Oval Office is of the best interest for the world as a whole. On multiple occasions, lines that he's used to receiving applause and taking breaks for were met with silence, in part because we know that many of our European allies do not see the United States as any longer a world leader when it comes to security issues, and boldly disagree with much of what the president has put forward. And it's telling to see how surprised Pence himself was that he wasn't met with the same type of support that he usually is met with when he's making these same statements on the campaign trail or within groups and here in the States that are used to supporting him and backing what the president believes to be in the best interest for the country and the world.
And David, in contrast to that, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, was well received. Her remarks, it was noted, she said she doesn't understand how possibly her country could be called a national security threat when BMWs are made in the United States these days. It was almost like a laugh line at the president's trade policies here, and saying here that he's vacating space to Iran. Our closest allies are really at a distance.
Yeah, it's no surprise that Angela Merkel's been at odds with President Trump, but she seemed, in this case, to be unbound by any concerns about her own political future, given that she's probably not, as said, she won't pursue another term as chancellor. But think about this. I was just thinking about last September at the UN General Assembly in New York. President Trump came up and said he'd done more than any other president in 2 years. He got laughed at. He went to France and Paris for the 100th year anniversary of World War I. And Emmanuel Macron, the French president, came up and delivered a very pointed rebuke of nationalism and things that Trump has talked about, with Trump right there in the audience. And now Vice President Pence goes to this Munich security conference and basically agreed with silence. I mean, what's worse, getting laughed at or having sort of radio silence? I'm not sure what's worse, but there continues to be this message, and Angela Merkel on her final sort of tour here in the next couple of years will be continuing to deliver this pointed rebuke of Trump.
I think that's why you saw a lot of lawmakers joining at Munich this weekend, because they wanted to go there to reassure our allies that we are still on your side. I mean, former Vice President Joe Biden also gave this speech to the audience, talking about how when I travel around the country and I talk to Americans, Americans still see you guys as important to our national security, that we still want to be in NATO and we're not looking at leaving NATO. Even the president had talked about doing such a couple of weeks ago. So you're seeing this sort of bipartisan pushback on the president, including several votes in the House and the Senate where they've actually rebuked the president's foreign policy. So we're just going to have to see, as time goes on, are more Republicans breaking with him on that to push back and sort of reclaim our standing in the world.
I think it's an important point, and we'll leave it there on that. Also interesting that Vice President Biden, former Vice President, was there. We haven't heard a lot from those who are expected to throw their hat into the ring for 2020 on national security, but he staked that out, at least for the weekend.